Thank you ever so much, everyone, for joining us here tonight. We're going to be talking about the film Push, which I assume you've all just watched. We're going to be talking about some of the very complex and wide-ranging issues that it brings up around not just housing and rights to housing, but the role of finance, globalization, land and property speculation. Now, before I introduce our guest and main speaker and our other speaker as well, first, can I start by thanking Breaking Ground, the new community-led housing hub for the Liverpool City Region, for organising this event as part of their launch festival and bringing the screening to you. If you want to know more about Breaking Ground, please do have a look at their new website. And just to introduce myself to you, well, I'm Peg Alexander. I'm a TV and radio broadcaster, journalist, presenter, and I once made a documentary myself, and I mentioned that because actually it was about community-led housing. And as a result of making this documentary about people-powered housing, I've ended up working in it as well. So I've got a bit of a double life. I'm part of the movement as well as being a presenter. But on to the main person you want to hear from tonight. We are so pleased to have Frederick Gertten joining us from Sweden. Frederick is an award-winning Swedish director and journalist. His films include, obviously, Push the film, but they also include Josie Gold, Becoming Zlatan, Bikes versus Cars, Big Boys Gone Bananas and Bananas. They've met audiences in over 100 countries and screened at leading festivals. In 1994, Frederick founded the production company WG Film, one of Sweden's most prominent documentary production companies, famous for local stories with a global understanding and impact. He's also worked as a foreign correspondent and columnist for radio, TV and press in Africa, Latin America, Asia and around Europe. And in 2017, he was named honorary doctor at Malmö University. Welcome, Frederick. Thank you so much for joining us in Sweden. We also have Paul Kelly, the director of Breaking Ground, on the call with us. Now, we're really sorry we couldn't be live. Unfortunately, it just wasn't possible, was it, to coordinate diaries and to go live. And that means obviously that we're not able to take questions, but I'm hoping that between me and Paul, we will ask the questions that probably you were going to ask anyway. So we'll try and bring as much stuff up as we can during the conversation. But Frederick, let me come to you first, because obviously everybody's just watched the film. You know, your work as a filmmaker, I mean, you've made films on all sorts, from a profile of one of Sweden's most successful footballers through to a film about whether we're actually ruled by cars. Push is an incredibly powerful film. Talk to us a bit about that role that you see between filmmaker, storyteller, and kind of campaigner, activist, message bringer of a different kind of world.
Well, that's a long story, but thank you for having me here. And no, I mean, every little film is an adventure and journey, quite often trying to understand things, you know, and that's my driving force, to understand what I see, and if that's something that happens around me in my own city, or if it's something that I see when I travel the world. And of course, Push, as you can see, is a journey trying to understand why it's getting more and more expensive to live everywhere around the globe. So it starts off with a very simple question. It's something I've seen. I've heard people talking about the stress in cities everywhere, that, you know, it's very expensive to live. I can't find a place. I have to move every 6 weeks. You know, all those stories, you hear them from all over the world. So I took off doing this film, and then of course in the research I found Leilani Farah, and I was lucky. It was lucky to find her, because she became almost my private detective in the film. You know, she's the one out there trying to understand this, and so
I can't imagine that film without her, really, and without the work that she did when she was in that role as the UN rapporteur.
That's true, but I probably would have done the film even without her. Then that would have been a different film. And I'm extremely blessed with her in many ways. Also because we became friends in many ways, and we started to send each other WhatsApp with stories, articles. What do you think about it? What is this? How do we understand this? So she was also partly shifting her own focus into more into what we call financialization of housing, how our homes suddenly is a part of a financial game, because it's not about owning a house, it's about having assets to financial games. So
Someone
it's,
calls it, one of the experts calls it a monster, don't they, in the film? I mean, that's kind of quite
yeah,
an
I
interesting
think the
phrase, and she uses it over and over.
it's Saskia Sassen, the amazing sociologist who says that, and I think the monster is a very good description, because it's there are all these conspiracy theories about the big evil power somewhere who decides everything, but it's not like that. It's a monster. It's a machine that rolls by itself, and the worst part of the monster is that we are also partly a part of it ourselves. Our own savings are also placed in funds that goes into this game. Our own pension funds are part of this game, which is kind of
For those of
insane.
us who have got pensions.
Yeah, but I mean, even if you have a small pension, your money is still growing in a way that might lead to that other people are losing their home, or your pension is making an Amazonas burn. So it's it's our own money. Are also part of the monster, which makes it harder to hit. And of course, there are some figures running these big hedge funds, but it's also armies of lawyers and middlemen who's a part of this machinery, the monster machinery.
Mhm.
And
That's that amazing, that great bit where they talk about the role of the law, isn't there, in the film, where they talk about, how finance can bring so much of the law in because they've got so much money, and they will do that, and they will bring the lawyers in. I mean, you do. One of the things that really struck me watching the film first time I watched it, which was actually at the start of lockdown, and watching it again, ready for this interview, is that whole multi-layered question on this, and just how complex this monster is, and the phrase that they use, and just how complex it is, and you think it's just about, do I have somewhere to live, and will, like the bloke in the film, when my heating breaks and my hot water goes, will someone come and fix it? Is that part of my rent? But actually it's part of this bigger machine. I think sometimes it's possible to feel very small and not able to change things, kind of feel a bit desperate. I mean, how much did you feel desperate when you were making it?
I don't know. Of course, I meet a lot of people who are desperate all the time. I'm quite focused on understanding stuff, and I'm happy when I found out that the financial crisis in 2008 was actually what changed the global housing market. Because after that, our homes became assets in this bigger financial game. So it's for me, I get a kick out of understanding things. So, but of course, and I don't like to feel hopeless, because I think if we feel hopeless, we stop doing things. I think knowledge is a weapon also for us. So we need to understand how they are doing it, and we also need to understand how they sell it, because it's very much about language. The people with most money, they are also buying a lot of political language. They have their think tanks, they have their influence companies. And I mean, you in the Brits are famous for having all these investments, political investments into your political life, and of course that's. Um, I think my film is also part of trying to create the counter language, and I think it's in that sense it's very simple, because what Leilani Farah is doing, she says housing is a human right.
Mm.
This is something that every government, every country around the world have signed it onto. It's law. It's international law. So I think, and I can see that already since the film has been out now for soon 2 years, is that people, activists around, politicians around the world is using this now much more. They stop saying housing market. They say housing is a human right. It shouldn't be a part of a traditional market. You can't make our homes part of a financial game. So I think this is happening, and I can see it happens in many countries. I mean, you can see in Denmark, for example, where we actually, when we premiered the film in 2019, and there was a big panel with a former housing minister and now the guy who is now the housing minister and other politicians. Now Denmark has a Lex Blackstone. They actually have a rent cap for 5 years, which is like forcing now companies like Blackstone to pay back money to tenants. The same has happened in Berlin. The same is happening also in Catalonia and Spain, and it's about to happen in the whole of Spain. So, and I mean, Portugal is now taking, and Canada is taking housing politics that are all human rights based. So it is happening. Politics is fighting back. And
well,
citizens,
political leadership is fighting back, isn't it? Because in all those examples, there will have been individual politicians, some of whom are in the film, that have led the way on that.
Mostly the city politicians, leaders in cities, they are closer to the citizens and they feel the stress. Because, I mean, even if you're a successful person, you have kids, you have the friends of your kids, you know that people are under a lot of stress. I mean, if you live in a city like London, everybody knows how difficult it is. It doesn't matter if you're a young doctor, you know, you're a young architect, somebody with an amazing future, you still can't afford to live in the town.
No, let's come back to the London question. I just want to bring Paul in at this point, because obviously you're sitting there quietly, Paul. I mean, that just it made me think, that whole question about asking Frederick, you know, did it make you feel desperate? Because of course that thing about challenging any feelings of desperation is exactly what you're sort of part of doing, which is giving people an answer to, no, we're going to change this ourselves.
Yeah, I think for me, what was interesting, it's funny, before I'd seen the film, and I watched it last night for the first time, people talk about the word powerful, and I thought, for me, what I thought most interesting about it was actually quite a gentle documentary for me. It wasn't ranting at me. It was just a kind of almost like an awakening in a way. And I think for us here in Liverpool, and particularly up north in north of England, where we have a city that's been going through, you know, still dealing with industrial decline, sort of 70, 80 years later. We've got a stable population now, but it had been declining for a long, long period. And Liverpool, you know, I was part of this journey, but we were European Capital of Culture 2008.
And a very successful one, we have to say, incredibly successful one.
Very successful, and culture has kind of given Liverpool, opened the door to a potential future. But now there is a real worry about how much that is controlled by local people. We have issues in the city at the moment around land deals and stuff like that being looked at. And I suppose the people here are clamoring for transparency, and we have certainly been pushing this film, no pun intended, around the city to get people to really watch it and just open up their thoughts about how we should be moving forward over the next 10 years. We have a moment here to just reset the dial, and I think this documentary really gave a kind of clear narrative of how that could look. And I think the other thing that really struck me, I don't know if Frederick's got any thoughts on it, but was about this notion also about how the individual can fit into that. I mean, I'm mid-50s. I have lots of friends, particularly down south, who buy into this money thing. They buy a property to make money and then to retire. And you know, we've all got an individual responsibility in this, as well as the machineries that kind of create these opportunities.
Is that sometimes I think it's a bit the British disease, Frederick. Maybe it's not, but that, you know, that concept, house prices are up, is a good thing. it's
No,
so
don't
ingrained
think,
in our culture.
I don't think it's only a British disease. But of course, there's different legislations. Here in Sweden, you can't really sit on several apartments in the same way. So it's that's a little bit more complicated. So, but people are still speculating here, and I mean, are people? I mean, that's what the 80s have taught people, is to be a part of that. All of us can be a part of the market. We can all be, you know, the day traders. All, I mean, it's like everybody's into money right now, and it's you know, and you make more money if you're interested into making money. If you just want to have a job, you know, it doesn't pay off, which is like totally silly. And of course that's, and you know, and people are not so interested in paying taxes. The only people paying taxes are the working people, which is like, so there is this total separation between the market and the rest of us, which of course is, so the divide in our societies are bigger. And of course there's a lot of people like your friends that are trying to be as smart as the other ones. And then it's understandable in some way. I'm not going to, you know, give the finger in that sense, but it is I mean, the politicians are talking about, you know, this a social contract. We should all be part of it. We should all be responsible. I mean, the moral we teach our kids, you know, is to be kind and to be responsible and nice to other people. But then we have a system that is like, if you the more crook you are, the better you do, you know, and so the criminals or the people who are helping the criminals, you know, to launder money and so on, they are the ones doing well. And so this is it's a disease in society that we need to fight in some way. So yeah, that's basically how I see it. I was thinking one thing, you said that Liverpool is still have a lot of space and is still has the possibility of growing back to where it was once upon a time. I think it would be interesting for you to look at Berlin or Barcelona, for example, because Barcelona and Berlin has been cities that have been, it's been very cheap to live. So it created a very cool vibe in these cities because artists could come, people could start up companies easily. They didn't have to, you know, they could be more creative. But suddenly, when the money people, because the money people are looking for undervaluated assets. So and when they found Berlin and Barcelona, it happened over a few years. It totally changed. So I think that's something you should look out for, because these hedge funds and speculators are there. They are monitoring the planet, and they have instruments to exactly see where things happens. Oh, let's buy 40,000 former coal miner apartments in the Czech Republic. Boom, you know, and then they have it for 4 years. This is Blackstone, and then they sell it on to someone else. You know, they are constantly looking for assets that are undervaluated, and they don't care about who's in those assets, because for them it's not about being a landlord, you know, because their clients are always the investor, not, you know, so it's a very different game. And I think if politicians want to care for the citizens, you have to find a way to fend those forces away in some way. I know that cities are poorer today than they were before, and so they need they need money, they need investors. But if you if you bring investors in, you have to find a way to also lock the door sometimes, or to control them in some way. And that's what happens on the 80s. I mean, we took down a lot of regulations, but we never closed the door again. So now the deregulation, the Thatcher era, the Reagan era, made cities and countries poorer, and made the financial people richer. And remember that the financial sector, they don't produce anything.
Mhm.
They don't really contribute to anything. It's the financial sector once upon a time was supposed to be a service sector to people doing real stuff. But now they are the ones on the top right now. And what are they doing? They're creating financial instruments, and then they're digging out values from what we do or from our lives. So there's a big job for politics here, and of course for activists and movements.
Of course, it's a really, I mean, you can say interesting time in the UK at the moment, because like everybody else, we're coping with the fallout from COVID. But our fallout is pretty big here in the UK from COVID. I mean, I know we could talk endlessly about the Swedish approach, couldn't we, on COVID, and the UK approach. But also we've got Brexit at the same time, which kind of has fallen off the agenda quite a lot since it happened. Nobody's really talking about it, but there's been odd bits coming out. So even London is already starting to see some of those changes. I mean, I think London's a really interesting example in the film, and I totally get why you spend a bit of time there, because the Grenfell Tower thing for me is, I don't mean to say symbolically, that's completely the wrong word, but how you have this tower block in one of the richest places in the world in terms of property. And yet so many people died because of poor cladding, and of course that's still ongoing in terms of responsibilities and what happens in that, and it's still, it's still there covered in the shroud. People, I think, still haven't been fully rehoused after Grenfell. That to me, and the whole thing about what happened with Notting Hill, which you obviously explain in the film very, very well. I mean, yeah, and for us that's very real. And I think in some ways we've just kind of accepted that's what's happened. That's progress. And then Grenfell brought it all back to us.
Yeah, I mean, Saskia Sassen asked, who are cities for? I mean, I think Leilani says, who are cities for?
Yeah.
And who, I mean, Notting Hill is a community that has been there for years and years and years. It's like it's a very classic part of London. But when the market people look at something like that, they don't care about the population, people living there. So they actually they like to shift the content of the city. They want to kick out people from the town. It's very clear. And when Grenfell was built in the 70s, or it was surrounded by slums, and now it's surrounded by extreme wealth, where you pay like £5 million for a 3-room, across the street from Grenfell, and where there is an extreme amount of empty homes around Grenfell, valued to millions of millions and millions and millions. Michael Bloomberg has a house very close to that. All those kind of, it's just, and all that criminal money, tax haven money, it's they just want to move.
It's a really interesting place, because my brother lives just very near Grenfell, and his stepson went to school at the bottom of Grenfell. I mean, they don't live in a, let's make it very clear, they don't live in a posh place. They live in a very, very small flat that him and his partner have lived in for forever and ever, and a rented flat. And they, and his stepson went to school just literally at the bottom of Grenfell. Loads of his friends grew up in Grenfell Tower. It's kind of just towards the end of their street. And it is really interesting, because I go and stay there quite a lot. And despite the wealth and everything around it, often when I'm there, I don't get a sense of being in a rich area actually at all. And it is that dichotomy of two kinds of life literally running side by side.
The other thing I was going to add into that is, in the mix here, we also have social housing providers, so particularly our housing associations. So and we've seen this a little bit in Liverpool, where they've started to trade between themselves in terms of their properties. So one social housing provider, they're very much driven by business now, so they might look at disinvesting what they own in a neighborhood because the values have gone down or whatever, so they just transfer them between each other and do deals between each other. Or equally, an area like Liverpool, where the city centre has started to develop, some of the beautiful old Georgian areas that I used to live in as a student, and right in the city centre, are now growing in value. So the social housing providers are starting to sell their properties to almost cleanse the community of, and how people get back into those places is a real challenge.
So let's move on to that. What can we do? Let's get positive.
Yeah, I mean, when the Danish housing ministers defended this new legislation with a rent cap, and they call it Lex Blackstone, they said also a bus driver and a nurse has the right to live in the city. I think it's a very simple sentence. So I think politicians should say, okay, yeah, we also want people, we want the people of Liverpool to live in Liverpool. We don't want to invite 100,000 new people and then kick out all the citizens of Liverpool today. The people who vote for me and I will kick you all out. This is almost what's happening. It's like, it's totally insane, but this is ongoing. So you have to find a way to defend your own citizens. And of course, you need to renovate houses. You need to take care of your city. There's a lot of challenges, of course, and you need money for that. And I understand that it's not always very easy for a politician, but still, the bottom line has to be defend your own citizens. The right to stay in the city.
And can I ask, so how were those politicians sparked? Like the Mayor of Barcelona, she was really powerful again in that film, very strong, very calm. The calmness is what I really took from this film. but actually making things happen was it felt like a moment. So what flicks that switch?
Barcelona is interesting because Spain was severely hit by the financial crisis, and there was a lot of properties caught in on the banks, and people were losing homes. So there was a big wave of evictions, and that the wave of evictions is still ongoing. And Blackstone, this American hedge fund, moved very early into Spain, and they bought the big banks and they bought debts from the big banks. So they were like suddenly the biggest landlord in Spain, and they've been driving this quick, but with big force. But then there was a movement against evictions. It's called PA. It's a very strong movement, and they actually go in and defend house by house, apartment by apartment, defend against evictions, both with lawyers and so on. PAH. It's a very cool movement. So the mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, is actually from that movement. So she was a famous housing activist that then became the mayor, and she was now re-elected. So she's been on for a while, but that it means that her crew that moved into the city hall was really people who understood these issues because they've been studying them in depth.
They've also been doing some work, as an aside, they've been doing quite a bit of work, haven't they, about what does a city look like when you design it for women. And in Barcelona, they've been leading that, which, and you design a city completely differently when you design it for women. It's really interesting, actually, how different cities look.
Yeah, I think, but it's also the housing issue at all. It's about homes. People live in the homes are both women and men. But of course, it has also pushed a lot of women in front in this struggle. I think in that sense you're right. But what they are doing in Barcelona, I think it's worth to study for politicians from the UK, because they are also working on legislation You know, they are trying to find legislation. So they, for example, they have now in Catalonia legislation that you have the right to expropriate apartments that are owned by banks who stand empty. So
Okay.
this is like
Well, they can take them over, or they can force them to be sold, or
they can take them over. And there's also a new legislation where the city can buy back apartments that stand empty, and they can buy them back for a lower price. So these are words that we haven't heard in the political language of nations for 50, 60, 70 years, expropriation, you know. But it tells a little bit about also how extreme the situation is. And in the Berlin, they have the same debate, that they want that there were public housing that was privatized 10, 15 years ago. There are also political talks about expropriating these companies, which is, it's kind of interesting.
it must be, because none of us know how much of our city centres, of all the big cities in Britain, especially London, but of all the big cities, how much of them are actually empty, we don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, you have a lot of empty properties owned by shell companies and tax havens, and especially in London, but also in other places in the UK. I mean, you can legislate around that if you want to. Of course you can. I mean, why should, if there is a need, if you have people sleeping rough on the streets, why should you have empty homes? You know, doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about COVID, if that's all right, because we haven't mentioned COVID, and obviously you made the film before COVID. What differences do you think there would be, Frederick, if you were making that film now? Or what, maybe let's try and keep on the positive move. Maybe what I should be asking you is, what opportunities do you think COVID has brought us in that everybody's talking about pressing reset?
I think the COVID crisis it's our interest in different ways. I know, for example, that even in the UK, you started to house homeless people in hotels, airport hotels outside Heathrow and so on. So there was something happening. Governments understood that you can't wash your hands if you sleep on the street. But what I understand, people are out on the streets again, so it was just for a very short time. But I think the most interesting thing with COVID is actually the parallel to the financial crisis 2008, is that, you know, Blackstone entered into the housing market, the hedge funds entered in 2012, 11, 12. So 4 years after the big crisis. So I think what we should look out for is what happens when all the aid packages are over. So we could maybe wait 1, 2, 3 years, and then something will break down where the society is not pumping out money and the public spending are not some, I mean, it's more, they've spent what they have. And then that's the moment for the hedge funds again
or the moment for politicians
buy up, to buy properties and whatever they want to buy. So I think if we want to avoid the mistake, because the 2008 crisis led to this even widening the gap of income inequality. That was Professor Stiglitz is also saying in the film. So if we want to avoid that, we need to start that struggle today, so we don't give away even more to these big monsters.
I think it's interesting that for me, COVID, like you say about home, I mean, it was very sad. Like just this weekend, there was a homeless young man in Manchester who was found dead on the street from the cold, because we had a cold snap, and that was after a period of everybody being housed. So when the will is there, something can happen. And interestingly, we're working with a group in Bootle in Liverpool called, it's a women's charity, the Venus Charity. And they took over one of the hotels in Liverpool and ran it as a homeless, that's what they do during the crisis. And it was a huge success. And all the people living in this hotel said, we want to do this permanently. And so we're working with them on developing a project that becomes a permanent solution. So I think that creates the hope that things can change.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to say, going back to your point before about politicians, it is about the will and and making things happen, isn't it? I think for me, that's where this film has got to be in our narrative in Liverpool for the next 12, 18 months, because our politicians can make what's happening in Barcelona happen. And I think we're at a moment here where that could be what we need to embed to make our region here different moving forward.
You have elections coming up in Liverpool.
We have elections in May. We have strong candidates who, Liverpool's always been interesting. It's been a bit of an activist city, a bit on the edge, but it never wants to embed anything. And I'm really arguing from our breaking ground that we're setting up that actually now's the time to start legislating. That's where you permanently make change happen. And so I was interested, you saying that, that meeting at the end with Leilani and all the politicians sat in a room, no huge fanfare, just talking to each other, gave me goosebumps. It was like, that's the moment. That's the moment.
Yeah, and this is also happening. So the initiative that kicks off in Barcelona and New York is the shift. And that's now, Leilani is now the global director of the shift, and cities and movements can join. So go to maketheshift.org. That's the website of her organization. And so I think that's a place for also Liverpool to enter. I mean, my city here, Malmö, Sweden, has entered, and they are entering with a human rights-based housing politics. Nobody really knows what that means, but now there are cities that are starting to work on it, and of course they are creating experiences.
But as you say, even just a city saying housing is a human right, not housing is a commodity, as a starting point, and saying in this city we believe that is a big shift. That is a big shift here. And from that, so much other stuff can flow. I want to just look at some questions that I know in previous discussions you've been asked, Frederick, because I'm conscious that we weren't able to go live. So if I just have a look at some questions that I know in previous things other people had other people had asked, to see if there's anything we haven't covered there. Somebody has asked about what they should do about their pension fund, or what they should do as an individual to stop the financialization of housing. This is at a previous event that we did. Someone said they changed their pension fund to an ethical fund and they support local business, but is that enough? What else can they be doing?
I think this is it's a very important question. I think we should all look at the financial industry and force them to work more, to invest in an ethical way. So, I mean, I think it was the Church of England who started to divest from the arms industry. And then from then on, people started to divest oil, coal, fracking, that's a strong movement. The next step should also be to divest practices that are threatening human rights. So and actually one of the bigger banks here in my country after the film has been out divested Blackstone.
Right.
So it is possible. So it's just about running the debate. And of course, then the next step is that also pension funds are quite often owned by unions, or so you could actually also push them from the other side, from the member side, that we don't want our money to grow, burning down Amazonas or kicking out people into the streets. We want our pension money to make life better for the future. Because what's the point if my pension goes up, if my rent also goes up, and the cup of coffee on the corner also goes up? So it's like, for us, it doesn't really matter. I could accept a lower pension if my rent was staying low. It's so I think that's something we all should look into, where our money is playing around, and why should we let an American hedge fund play around with our money?
There's another question that was asked, as I say, to this previous event that we did, and I think it'd be interesting to get your take, and then Paul, come to you on this one. And this was about coalitions. I'm just going to read the question that somebody asked at a previous event. They said, how do we form coalitions that have adequate power to combat what they, in the question, they call the opportunism, which is provided by simply having an awful lot of money? How do we bring the same into the same room the exercise of planning powers with the resources to enable joint working in neighbourhoods? And then they say, how can we establish approaches which are creative and hard-nosed, but ensure that the benefit is kept local and all of the players have shared aim? There we go. Answers on a postcard. So that's quite a tricky question, isn't it? How do we do it?
For Paul.
Well, I suppose what Breaking Ground is trying to do, and what setting up these hubs to support communities to take back control, and then provide the advice and support to enable them to set up their own structures and organizations to do that, I think is the first thing. So in Liverpool, we want to have far more. We housing co-ops in the 70s and 80s. That was the revolution, was in Liverpool, but we haven't built on that. And those organisations came about a lot through struggle. So imagine what could happen if we enabled those structures to happen. So that's the first thing. But I think the other thing, and I was already kind of on this trajectory anyway, but this film has made me realise more and more. It's then connecting that with the political will. It's making that really real, and for people to really understand it in a very simple way, because it isn't that complicated actually when you watch a documentary like this. But it's then turning something into action, and maybe post-COVID, that's the world we're in, where people are now willing to legislate for some of this and make and that powered by the skills and support to enable people to do it themselves can make the change, I think.
Every area is going to have their build back better strategies, aren't they?
Oh, I mean, as you were saying before about advertising within a couple of weeks in the UK, we were already talking about building back better. It had already been sloganed and everything. But actually, what does that actually mean? Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
What I can do is offer my film to be used, because that's what I've shown this film on all continents, in many different countries, and wherever I go, the film creates a local debate. Doesn't matter if it's Kuala Lumpur or if it's Cape Town or if it's El Salvador or Bogota or Chile or the US. It creates a local debate. So, and I think that's because the film is like zooming up a little bit. We're not talking about those specific countries, but we're talking about a global pattern. And you can find that pattern also in your own city. And when you see the pattern, it may be easier also to defend what you have and to fight what you don't like. I think that's my little gift.
Absolutely. And obviously cities can join the maketheshift.org that Leilani's set up. I mean, just the kind of to leave us, Paul, come to you first. What's your kind of overarching thoughts that you're going away with from having watched the film and talking with Frederick tonight? And then Frederick, I'll come to you. What are the one or two messages you'd really like to say to Liverpool and the Liverpool City region?
Yeah, I think, I'm glad I've seen this film. I'm glad you made it. I think I like what you say. I mean, that must feel great actually to have this. It's a tool. It's a toolkit for us to just remind ourselves of what we need to be mindful of and then take action of. So, it's another tool in my armory. And this, as we launch our festival at the weekend and our project here in Liverpool, we will be this film, we will be making sure is seen over the next 12 months significantly and creates that debate. So yeah, feel very optimistic about that as well.
That's cool. Well, that's exactly what I want to hear. I'm so happy when my film is used by cool people who want to create change. I can also say that Leilani and I has since the pandemic started a podcast, which we call Pushback Talks. So it's out on all platform, and we recorded like 25 episodes where we deepen and update stories from the film, and of course from her work and what we see and so on. We will continue now in a few weeks again. We will also try to invite mayors and top politicians and so on, but also activists, so to keep talking about what we think is important. And I think that what we need to take to our heart is that change is possible. we can do something, even if these forces, the monster is very, very strong, obviously very strong. But I think change is possible, and this is a very good moment now post-COVID. So just go for it, and thank you for your great work. It's cool to be a part of it, and keep me posted on what you do. And you can also always tag me on Twitter, and so also Leilani and the film, and then we will share your events further on. So let's keep working together. It's a good thing.
Thank you both.